The night was dark. The lights were turned off throughout the entire city. Ice had covered the power lines and the maple that was a beautiful shade tree during many a hot summer for the town now creaked from the weight of the ice. The only light shown was the fullness of the moon peeking in and out behind the clouds, and lanterns shone through windows of people's houses and in a few businesses that were still opened. Hilda stepped out onto the street from the small house where her and her sister lived, wrapped in a long coat with her grey hair shining from under her hat. She noticed a dark shadow appearing around the side of the building, so instead of heading for Harry's she turned and ducked back inside quickly. She didn't know who it could be out lurking in this weather at this time of night. "Was it too cold for you tonight to sneak down to Harry's for a little nip, sis?" Hilda's sister asked. Martha looked much younger than Hilda, even though they were very close in age. Martha's hair was still blonde without a touch of grey in it. People often thought Martha dyed her hair, but she would never even consider it. Martha weighed 20 pounds less than her sister, and her skin was a soft tan with not as many wrinkles around the eyes as her sister had. Although Hilda, who already had a full head of grey hair, neither her or Harry had minded it. "I was just checking the weather. The maple across the street is loaded terribly with ice." Hilda started taking her coat off. She had thought for sure her sister had gone to bed by now. She did see her go into her room like she always does at this time every night. Martha sat at the kitchen table reading yesterday's newspaper. That's everyone's favorite shade tree in town. She started to flip the page when an interesting story caught her eye. Spooner's back. That was all this small town needed, was another storm. Martha and Hilda used to fight over Spooner before he moved to a bigger city where there was lots of news for him to have printed in their paper. Hilda joined Martha at the table, leaning in to look at the photo of Spooner and trying to read the small writing. What could he possibly be doing back here? Hilda wondered. "It says here he's doing a story on the worst ice storm to ever hit this town. 35 years, Martha thought, and it took an ice storm to bring him back there." Hilda remarked on the black and white photo that showed Spooner's suit jacket with a tie and his hair combed nicely over. "He's handsome, just like he was before he left." Neither one of the two sisters could tell what color his hair was now. While sitting next to Martha, Hilda was thinking about being interviewed by Spooner and getting to tell him first before her sister about the ice storm. She imagined herself telling Spooner about how the ice storm happened, how scared she was, and how much better she feels now just knowing he's close back in town. Martha interrupted her thoughts. "Do you think he's married by now?" Hilda was thinking she would get to find out first. It is a possibility. She got up from the table and looked out the window, seeing nothing but pitch dark. Where could she be? Harry started to pace back and forth across the small floor of his drugstore. What's keeping her? Growing impatient and worried at the same time, he started to pace even faster. His granddaughter Maggie looked up from her newspaper. Maybe she's not coming tonight. It is slippery out. Maybe the ice is holding her in. Then she went back to reading. Maggie was reaching nearly 19. She barely had longer hair than her grandfather, but she liked how it was cut, and she would dye it soon so it wouldn't be the same color as his brown hair. Even though his hair was brown, his short beard and moustache had already turned grey. He stomped back and forth while trying to come up with a thought of what could have happened to Hilda. He stopped pacing. She could have fallen on ice. Maybe I should go look for her. Hoping that Maggie would agree. She usually shows up here every night to have a nip around this time after her sister goes to bed. The only agreement he could get from his granddaughter was a nod of the head. He made a fast step to the door when Maggie's words stopped him halfway outside. Shouldn't you take a bottle? She pretended to be reading as she watched her grandfather come back inside, acting as if he forgot his hat and snuck a small bottle into his coat, then hurried out the door. On the sidewalk, Harry took his time, taking small soft steps towards Hilda's, being very careful, trying not to slip. He was already nearly halfway there. He could see Hilda's light from the lantern through the window. He paused to listen. It was quiet but for the maple groaning. He could have sworn he heard what he thought were footsteps crunching ice. He continued walking, then stopped again to listen. This time he caught a glimpse of a shadow coming from around beside a building. Harry then tried to take off running, but slipped on ice and fell down, breaking the bottle he had in his coat, and the liquid poured out. He saw the shadow approaching closer, so Harry made it to his feet and started running, slipping and sliding the rest of the way to Hilda's. Harry banged desperately on the door, hoping Hilda hadn't gone to bed too. He couldn't see anyone, nowhere. The shadow was gone. "Do you hear someone knocking?" Hilda looked at Martha. Martha had heard the pounding on the door too. She arose from the table to see who was at the door. It could be an emergency. Hilda moved from the window to follow Martha to the door. Maybe it's Spooner. Hilda was getting excited to see who was pounding on the other side of the door. Just when Harry had thought he would have to make a new door, he heard a latch sound and Martha threw the door around. He was never so happy to see Hilda's sister before. "There's your emergency." Martha looked at her sister and pointed at Harry. "Don't just stand there, Harry. Come over by the fire and I'll get you some coffee." The old gent nearly looked frozen, standing in the doorway and wet from the bottle that had broken. Although Harry wasn't sure if it was the coldness outside or seeing the shadow that made him shake so much. "Be glad to." He managed a stiff smile and did like Hilda had said to do. Martha added a few more sticks to the flame while Hilda boiled the water for coffee on the wood stove. Just when Hilda started to ask Harry what brought him out this late and especially this dark, there was another knock on the door, beating hard and fast. Come on, open up," they heard a woman say from the other side of the door. Martha hurried to open the door. She was surprised to see it was Maggie, Harry's granddaughter. She mumbled, "Who's going to show up next?" Harry and Hilda just watched. "Oh, sorry, Martha." Maggie apologized for nearly knocking Martha down while bursting through the door with excitement and carrying the old newspaper. "I got great news." Not giving anyone time to ask what the great news was, Maggie blurted, "A reporter is in town. Spooner," holding up the newspaper for everyone to see. "I got his autograph when he came into the drugstore. He traded it for a Band-Aid. He slipped on ice." Harry wasn't sure who Spooner was. He didn't like to read much. "Who's Spooner?" Maggie looked surprised. "Can't you read?" "Not much." Harry grinned at Maggie while being sarcastic. "He gathers reports for this newspaper. He's here to do a story on the ice storm." She handed him the newspaper to read. Hilda and Martha moved near Harry to see the paper like they hadn't seen it once already earlier that night. Harry had moved to town many years after Spooner had left. He had no idea about the conflict between Hilda and Martha over Spooner. They often fought over who saw him first and who he loved better. Maggie looked at Hilda, then at Martha. She said in a low voice after her excitement had left, "Oh, he said he knew Hilda and Martha from years ago." Hilda started to blush. She didn't know what to say to Harry. Martha was just glad he remembered her. Harry finished reading the article, then he caught what Maggie had just said. Oh, did he now? He threw the newspaper down and started rolling his fists while jumping around the floor. The water was boiling for coffee, and so was Harry's temper. So he thinks he can just come back here and steal my Hilda, does he? It's a good thing I wasn't at the drugstore. He did have a thought that it could be Martha he was here to see instead of Hilda. Maggie stopped Harry's nonsense with two words. He's married. Then she remembered about the dot maple she saw on her way over. Oh, and I forgot to tell you the maple across the street, it looks like it could fall any second. Harry was glad someone stopped him. He was getting tired from so much movement and relieved to hear there was no competition for Hilda. Although Hilda and Martha felt a little let down, not so much about the tree going to fall, but the man they loved and fought over for years was married now. Seconds later, everyone heard a loud crackling with a huge boom. Everyone headed for the door. Maggie was first. The elderly were following fast as they could move to see the old maple on the ground, stretched out into the street with Spooner pinned under a limb. Don't just stand there gazing. Get this thing off of me, Spooner yelled out. Harry chuckled. There's a story for you. Then he moved fast as he could on the ice to get something to pry with. Everyone pulled, pushed and prized while Spooner scooted out from under one of the maple's limbs. I sure am grateful to all of you people. Hilda and Martha rushed to Spooner, one sister on each side leading him towards the house with Maggie following, leaving Harry out in the street by the tree. It's only a scratch. No one seemed to have heard Harry. They were busy getting the reporter inside to get him warm and also to tell him about the ice storm.